Hi everyone, I'm Allan Deutsch. I'm a product manager at Microsoft, and I'm here today to tell you about tools for thinking. These are tools that are going to help you become 1% better every single day. To start with, I want to explain why we're focused on 1% growth. 1% isn't a lot, what good is that? And the reason I like to focus on 1% growth is because 1% is pretty small. It's a very achievable milestone to shoot for, being just that little bit better than you were yesterday. And the other part is that it's sustainable. You don't have to make giant leaps and bounds in order to be able to keep it up. You just have to do those small incremental improvements every day, which makes it possible to continue doing it for the long haul, which is really important. To really understand the value of 1% growth, I find it really helpful to look at graphs of it. So in this graph, starting from 100% of where you are today, over the course of a year of 1% growth, you'll observe that you'll be several times better than you were at the start. But even this graph doesn't show the full picture, because on this one, that 1% growth every day is based on where you started, not where you were yesterday. And so if we take that into account and we get the compounding part, what we see instead is this graph. And so not only are you a few times better, but closer to 40 times better, which is absolutely astounding. And so this is the trajectory that I want you to have. In this presentation, I'm going to teach you about some of the skills and techniques that I use and that you can use as well in order to become 1% better every day. At its core, product management is knowledge work. And that means that you're essentially being paid to use your brain to solve hard problems. So you're going to apply all of the things that you've learned, create new ideas, condense them, share them, refine them, iterate on them, and ultimately use them to produce meaningful outputs that can change the world. In order to be effective at that, you need to be effective at the fundamentals. Those fundamentals are a really important part of taking knowledge work seriously. And it's not that I don't think you take your job seriously, but rather that if we look at knowledge work sort of holistically and compare it to other domains where the performers are essentially paid for their performance quality, things like athletics or musicians, in those other disciplines, it's very common to practice the fundamentals. A concert pianist doesn't practice for a concert by just playing the pieces that they're going to be performing in the concert. They practice their scales for hours, different notes, different segments of it. In athletics, the same thing is true. Serena Williams is not just playing tennis matches all day, every day in order to practice for a big championship at Wimbledon. She's going to be practicing the same serve for hours or practicing returning in a certain way so that when that scenario comes up in one of those matches, she's prepared and ready for it. But in knowledge work, we don't do the same thing. We don't practice the fundamentals. You're not sitting there drilling on how to learn every day for an hour. But I think it's important to do these things because knowledge is a compound growth system. And that means the more of it you have, the more valuable it is, because the more you know, the more you can combine it with other things you know to create new insights or solve new, harder, or more interesting problems. I'm excited to dive into this content with you. But before we do that, I want to make sure we're all aligned on what the fundamentals of knowledge work are. The first one is growing your knowledge pool. This is important because whenever you're making decisions, you're drawing on the experiences and wisdom that you've either had yourself or learned through a variety of other sources, whether it's reading, watching YouTube videos, a mentor, or any other method. The next one is synthesizing new knowledge and insight, because you're probably going to face new problems of some sort in your career as a product manager. And so it's really important that you be able to take those things that you've already learned and build on top of them or combine them in new and interesting ways to generate insights and new ideas that solve the problems that you're faced with. Finally, we need to focus on producing output. And so this might be things like a feature spec or a presentation, or a pitch. And these are the ways that you take those ideas and share them with others so that collectively you can build whatever it is that you need to do. At their most basic, these three things can be distilled down to learning, thinking, and doing. If you disagree or you think maybe I've missed something that's also fundamental to knowledge work, that's okay. I probably did, and I would love to hear from you about it. But for the purposes of this talk, we're going to focus on these three. So in order to dig into those, we're going to learn about three different systems that you can use in order to improve at each of those different areas. The first one is spaced repetition, which is a learning technique that helps you retain things indefinitely, as well as be able to apply them more effectively in your everyday life. The next one is personal knowledge management, which is a system for managing the things that you've learned so that you can combine them together, revisit them, and use them to solve problems and generate new insights. Finally, we have incremental writing, which is a process building on spaced repetition in order to improve your outputs. The first one of these fundamentals we're going to look at is learning. And this is because learning is the most basic piece of knowledge work. Everything else builds on top of it. In order to think about things, you have to have a background of learnings and ideas and lessons that you draw on in order to have those thoughts. So to start with, we're going to think about passive learning. Passive learning is the most common way people learn things. This is the type of learning where you read through a book, but you're not taking any notes, you're not writing summaries of each chapter or section. You're not thinking about the points the author made or trying to refute them or evaluate them or find applications of them. You just sort of read from the top to the bottom of the page, go to the next page, you read to the top to the bottom, you flip it, and you keep going just like that, not ever really actively engaging in it or questioning the content. Same thing happens with watching a YouTube video or a conference presentation where you're not taking notes or otherwise engaging or asking questions. And so when you learn passively, you don't actually retain what you learned very well. So this graph is called the forgetting curve, and it was a part of a landmark psychology study that found that if given random syllables, people would forget them extremely quickly. And over time, the retention was absolutely abysmal. And so when you learn passively, this is what your retention looks like. It's called the forgetting curve. This is not the level of learning that you're going to need in order to really do great knowledge work and to have that 1% growth every single day. To give you some concrete data points, when you learn something passively, within an hour, you'll have forgotten half of it. And after a week, 90% of it is gone. And if you spend all of that time only to get value out of 10% of it, that's not very good. That's a pretty low return on your investment of time. And so what we want to do is increase that retention so that the time you spend learning things is more valuable and more productive. What we want to do to improve the retention of the things we learn and get that improved ROI is something called active learning. And so active learning has two main benefits. The first one is that it's going to reset that forgetting curve. And what that means is that when you do active learning, it brings you back up to the top of that curve again where you retained 100% of it. But the really key pivotal piece of this is that not only does it bring you back to the top of the curve, but it reduces the rate you forget things. So it sort of flattens that curve out just a little bit. And by doing so, you're able to retain things longer, and then you don't have to relearn them as frequently. So what is active learning? You're probably familiar with it from some of the techniques that you might have experienced as a student. These are things like tests or quizzes, where, at the end of maybe a chapter, when you were reading a textbook, it would have a list of questions that you have to answer, or at the end of a unit in school, they're going to ask you questions about those things you've learned. But there are other activities as well, like writing a summary of what you read. This is actually a great way to improve your retention because when you write a summary, you're not just passively engaging with the content, you're actively engaging by trying to think through what the key pieces of that content were and rewrite them in your own words. Another really common one is flashcards, where you get like a prompt and then you have to think about, okay, what is the answer for this prompt? And then you think about it, you dig deep into your brain to try and figure it out, and then you get to check your answer and see if you were right. So these sorts of techniques are the things that compose active learning. At a high level, it's really just engaging with the content you're learning about. So spaced repetition, that learning technique I mentioned earlier, is essentially this practice of active learning spaced out over increasing periods through time. And so when you first learn something, you start forgetting it quickly. But then if you practice active learning, such as by reviewing a flashcard or quizzing yourself on that content and having to actually think about it and try to remember that information, not only does that improve your retention, but it flattens that forgetting curve, which means you don't have to review it again for quite a bit longer than the first time. And so you might review things at first after 1 day, but then after 2 more days, then after 3 or 4 more days. And as this process goes on through time, you might not need to review something for years, but you'll forget it so slowly that you'll still have retained 80 to 90% of that content, even after 4 years have passed without you necessarily having thought about it at all. And so this is an incredible superpower for being able to learn things and retain the things that you learn. Spaced repetition memory systems not just improve your ability to retain that knowledge, though. They also improve your ability to apply what you've learned. And so this takes it from something that you know about, like how to add numbers, to actually identifying those opportunities to apply the thing you've learned and realize when it's occurred and actually use whatever it is that you learned in order to solve the problems in front of you. So some of the really cool properties of these spaced repetition memory systems are that your knowledge is going to grow linearly, because as and this is assuming you're adding a fixed amount of new prompts or ideas to your sort of pool of spaced repetition every day. But if you're adding 5 new things every day, you're going to continue growing at that rate of 5 new things every day indefinitely. But because you retain things longer and longer, the more times you've reviewed them, the amount of time you actually have to spend reviewing stays pretty close to constant. So for maybe 5 to 10 minutes a day, after a year of learning 10 new things a day, you'd know 3,650 things. But then after 10 years, you'd still only be investing that same 5 to 10 minutes a day, but you'd know 36,000 things that you hadn't known before. And so this is an incredibly time-efficient way to learn as well. And so not only does it improve how effectively you retain things and your ability to apply them, but it's also more time efficient than other learning techniques. Okay, I know what you're thinking. All of this theory stuff is great, but how do I actually use spaced repetition in practice? That's the key piece that's really going to get you the results that you're looking for. So the first thing that you need to do is write prompts and answers. And the way that you can think about this is you're writing flashcards for yourself. You're almost programming tasks for yourself to do in the future. And so when you see that prompt, you want something that's going to light up the right bulbs in your head so that you have the thoughts that you need in order to come to the same conclusion. And so there's a little bit of intention that needs to be taken with this prompt design, but you'll get the hang of it over time as you practice more and more and write more prompts and go through and review them. On the reviewing side, you want to review every day. Generally, spaced repetition scheduling happens on the cadence of days. And so you're going to review something after 1 day or 3 days or 7 days or whatever. And so in order to hit those scheduled intervals or repetitions, you need to review every day. And by doing this consistently, you're able to keep the time commitment each day pretty low. I like to do this over 5 to 10 minutes every morning while I drink my tea. And I find that's a really great system for me. You don't have to do it. You can find some other method that works for you. But the key part of this is consistency. Now, when you schedule these, it's possible to do it on your own, and there are some really simple systems for doing so. But my real recommendation here would be to use a tool, some sort of software that automates this for you so that you don't have to figure out which cards to review on which day. You just hit go, and the tool will bring up the ones that you need to review that day for you to review. Then as you go through and review these prompts, you're going to see the prompt. And so it might ask you a question or something along those lines. And before you go any further, you're going to think about it. You're going to actively engage with that content. This is that active learning that we talked about. And the point of this is that it causes you to really think about this content, and that thinking is what makes it stick. But then once you've reviewed it, you've got to check your answer. And generally when you do that in some sort of spaced repetition tool, it's going to give you a few different options for reviewing it based on how difficult it was for you to come up with the answer. And so generally these will be something along the lines of hard, easy, or good. And you can think of good as sort of the just right of spaced repetition prompts, where you had to think about it for a bit, you got the right answer, but it didn't come to you easily. And so depending on which one of those answers you provide, the scheduling system can vary how far out it's going to push that review. So if you reviewed something and you got the wrong answer, you mark it as hard, and the algorithm's going to show it to you sooner so that you review it more immediately and you're able to build up that retention again. On the other hand, if something was extremely easy, it's going to push it out even longer than usual, because if you can recall it that well, you probably don't need to review it as soon. Then for things that felt pretty good, where you maybe had a little bit of difficulty or you had to think about it for a bit, but it did come to you eventually and you got it right, either in whole or most of it, those are the ones where you're going to mark it as good, and it'll get scheduled the sort of standard repetition distance. So to recap the things that we've learned about learning, the first one is active recall or active learning. So that's those actions where you're really actively thinking about what it was that you learned, you're engaging with that content, and that's the key piece here that helps you retain it. The next one is spaced repetition, which is going through that active recall process over increasing intervals in time. And of course, the forgetting curve, which is the rate at which you lose retention of information you learned. And that's the thing that we're trying to flatten out and address by using active recall and spaced repetition. Our next topic is thinking. And so this really is going to build on the things that you've learned through the course of your life and your career, and help you apply them to solve the new problems that you face in everyday life. So consistent results need repeatable processes. If you do something differently every time, you're going to get different results every time. And so if you don't have a repeatable process for how you think, you're not going to be able to get consistent results in having novel insights or creating new ideas. So what we're going to focus on here is how we can build up a repeatable process for thinking about problems so that we're able to have more consistent results. So solving problems requires creativity. Even if the problem has been solved before, or a similar problem has been solved before by someone else, it's still going to be new to you at some point. And you can learn from similar problems or similar ideas that have happened before, maybe in other domains or on other products, and you can take those ideas and just recycle them and apply them in this new context of your product or your company or your tool that you're building, whatever it may be. So it's important to have a way of being able to do this reliably so you can get those consistent results that you want. And when you have a process like this, the value of everything you know gets compounded because you're able to draw on it more readily. And so the next step is figuring out how we can do this reliably. The tool we're going to be learning about for thinking is something called personal knowledge management, or PKM. This is a reasonably new term or idea, but it's been around for a while through different names like Zettelkasten, which was invented by a sociologist who used it to manage his knowledge and produce phenomenal results. The idea behind personal knowledge management is that we learn things from a huge variety of sources, whether it's webinars like this one, reading books, watching YouTube videos, our lived experiences, talking to a mentor, Twitter, or any number of other sources. And it's very difficult to aggregate all of those things together in a way that you can draw on any of them at any time when you need it. And so the goal of personal knowledge management is to help you build your own individual repository of the things that you know and that you've learned in a way that they're all collected together in one place where you can connect them together and link them and build on them and iterate on them and ultimately use them to produce things. So why would you want to use personal knowledge management? Obviously, cataloging your knowledge is really useful. If you don't remember where you learned something interesting, you can't go back and learn more on it. But if you have it, or at least a summary of it, cataloged in your personal knowledge management system, and you include the references of where you learned about these ideas, then you can go back and revisit it if it comes up again. It also means that when you're doing something new, you don't have to start from a blank slate or a blank page. I mean, honestly, in my experience, when you have to start a new presentation or a feature spec, and you open it up and you've got a new PowerPoint or a new Word document and there's just nothing there, that's the worst. It's, you've got nothing to work from. And I used to have that situation all the time. But because of personal knowledge management, now I have this huge pool of all of the things that I've learned and recorded and aggregated into my PKM. And so when I start, I can draw from all of those. I can take pieces out and put them into whatever it is that I'm working on. And so instead of starting from a blank slate, I can pull up my notes on a variety of different related topics and start from there. And so instead of that blank page, I start with often even more content than I need. And so most of the work becomes curation and connecting rather than creating something net new from scratch. I also really like personal knowledge management because it helps with developing ideas. And so when you have a few related ideas and you see them and you can think about them and they're written down, you can build on them. When an idea is in your head, it's just soft and fuzzy and it's hard to manipulate and iterate on and refine. But when you write it down, you have something concrete and tangible. You can change the wording or the phrases to refine the idea. And over time, by iterating on these things, you can build much more high quality, fully fleshed out ideas. And when you do that, and they're all here in this one place, you can recycle them in new places. Maybe you learn something on one project that you would not have thought is generalizable information, but then you're working on another project and you realize, wow, actually, for this feature that I'm working on, I could totally leverage what I learned on that previous one and use it. And, with all of the new insights that you've accumulated since then, maybe you can do an even better job with it. And ultimately, the real value of this is that much like network effects elsewhere, the value of any new knowledge that you add grows exponentially because you can connect it in new and exciting ways. So in order to use a personal knowledge management system, this is roughly the process I go through. So it starts by summarizing the things I learned in my own words. And this is really the ingestion piece. You can learn things from any number of sources. So taking those and consolidating them into a consistent format. For me, I use Markdown notes, but you could use something else if you prefer. That puts them all into a sort of consistent format so it's easy to organize them. And it's really important to do this in your own words because that's that active learning piece. That's where you're really engaging with the content and thinking about it a little bit. And that's going to help you really retain it and internalize what you're learning. Then once you have those notes consolidated into your own words and in your own format, you can refactor them into more concise, focused notes. And so instead of having say a note on a book you read, and it's your notes from that book, you want it to be focused on really specific topics, like how to scale a product from 10 to 1,000 users. And it's going to have all of the things that you learned on that really concise topic. And this is important because when the notes that you have are really focused, connecting them together gains specificity. So if I were to make a connection between a note on scaling products and some book I read where I learned how to go from 10 to 1,000 users, it's not clear when I click that link and go through and read some big long book summary why I was linking there. But when I really focus it onto this specific piece, I get exactly the bit of information that I was going for. It also has the added benefit of making it easier to combine. Because if I remember roughly what the lesson was or the topic, then I can connect to it without having to remember where I learned it from. And additionally, if I learn something closely related from another source, instead of going to a note on some different source of content and updating that with information from yet another source, I'm updating a note on a specific topic, and I can have all sorts of different sources where I learn about scaling a startup. So this is really a valuable piece. Then the next step is linking and connecting your ideas together. And so in order to facilitate this, I like to think of titling my notes as API design. You're essentially building them into pieces that you can invoke elsewhere. And so when you are writing a new note to develop a new idea, you can use those titles as almost the building blocks or API calls that help you build up to a higher order idea. And this is really important because by building up those ideas from the sort of maybe not quite first principles, but the lower level ones, it makes it a lot easier to think about these more complex concepts. And by condensing the larger concept into just the title of the note for it, it makes it a lot less information that you have to retain in your working memory while you're trying to think through something, which makes it easier to focus on those higher order parts of the idea. And then you want to iterate on these things over time, right? You don't just write the note and then forget about it and never see it again. You want to go back through and review this content, update it, iterate on it. You can even schedule reviews of your notes using spaced repetition, which is the incremental writing technique we talked about. And that's going to help you go back and look at them with fresh eyes over time so that you can continue to develop and refine them. So I have those tips that I shared with you for making notes. And I want to highlight the term making notes, because when most people think about notes, they think of it as taking notes. And that's really, you're just taking what's there and recording it, right? Like what people said at a meeting or what the action items are or what the author said in a book. And by reframing that as making notes, it's not just taking what's already there, but really you're making something new. Even if the idea isn't new, you're putting new words to it. And so you're giving it a bit of a new life and making it your own. And I think that's a key distinction for making notes that really helps frame that personal knowledge management piece. Additionally, by doing that, you're again hitting that active learning piece, which is really going to help you retain what you've learned and internalize the ideas that you have. So I also think that by sticking with these tips, it's a lot easier to share your ideas. Because if you have maybe some ideas that build on something you learned in a book, you can't just share that one specific idea if it's locked away in some big long note on your summaries from that book. And so I think by parting these pieces out into really isolated, specific elements, you're able to much more easily share them. And so then when you're sharing that with a teammate or a friend or anyone else, you can focus on just the piece that you think is relevant to them. And this is also true for other sorts of outputs, like if you're building a blog post or a feature spec. And so working up to those higher outputs is the thing we're going to cover next as we focus on doing. Now, as great as it is to learn things and be able to think really effectively, ultimately, doing is the most important part of this whole presentation. And the reason for that is very simple. Results are everything. It doesn't matter how much you know or how great of a thinker you are if you can't produce the results that you want and you need in order to be successful. Now, as I'm sure you know, in order to get great, consistent results reliably, you need a process that's able to consistently produce them. So, in order to operate that process, you need some way of defining it. And fortunately, we already learned what we need in order to do that. Spaced repetition is programming. So if you think about this slightly differently, when you write a spaced repetition prompt, you're just programming your future attention in such a way that when you see the code or the prompt of the spaced repetition flashcard, you're expecting that your brain in the future is going to go through the right series of thoughts and processes and neurons firing in order to have that correct idea that you wanted it to have when you originally wrote the prompt. And we can use this same sort of technique for generating our outputs as well. The next piece of this puzzle is understanding how we can program ourselves to generate the outputs that we want in the future. And so by applying spaced repetition to output, we get something called incremental writing. And so this is where you write based on the starting prompt that you have over increasing periods of time. And every time you revisit what you're writing, you're coming back to it with a new context. Maybe you've learned some new things, you've gained some perspective, you've realized some things that weren't there, or some new data has come to light. And so you're able to broaden or solidify what's already there and produce a higher quality output. And the spaced repetition scheduling system can assist you in this in helping you revisit those things that are important consistently over time. Generally, we use our words to share ideas. And I realize this is a slightly biased view of things. I work in developer-facing products and APIs and services, and so most of what I do is text-based, although I suspect that these same techniques would be just as effective if you work in a more visual space, working on things like user interfaces or other visual design elements. But there are all sorts of different formats that we essentially use words to convey ideas to varying types of audiences, such as these listed. And so by having a process for being able to iterate on those consistently over time and apply our ideas and our learnings to them to produce better outputs, we're able to improve our results. So this is roughly the process that I go through whenever I'm creating some sort of output. I'll start by making an outline, and this is usually just like a bulleted and indented list of the key pieces or ideas that I want to hit on. And each of those will essentially start out as the title of a new note. And as I go through, I'm going to add all of those notes to my incremental writing queue, which is essentially just a spaced repetition deck specifically for writing things. And I'm going to fill out those notes over time. And so each of them is reasonably small and isolated and self-contained. On its own, it may not be enough to define a feature spec or produce a blog post on a new feature that the team is releasing. But I find that a lot of them end up being reusable in several of these different elements. And so a note that I write originally as part of a feature spec might also be useful in a blog post announcing that feature to customers because it explains what the problem is and how we're solving it. And it could also work as marketing copy for people who aren't necessarily customers yet, but maybe they're experiencing that same problem. And so I'll work on these notes and continue iterating on them over time as the spaced repetition prompts remind me to. And eventually they get to a point where they're reasonably stable and mature, the ideas are well developed and fleshed out, and then I can go back to that outline. And instead of starting from an almost blank page, I have a rich library of content that I can pull from in order to build out that finished piece. And so then instead of it being an exercise in filling up a blank page with a whole bunch of great ideas that I have to come up with on the spot, it becomes a much simpler and easier task of compiling together these different ideas that I've already noted down as being related to this thing. Maybe I need to refine them or tweak them a little bit so that they flow together, add some connective elements that maybe didn't fit into any of those notes on their own, but help bring one idea together with another. And then I iterate and refine on that result over time as well, until finally I have something that's ready for the world or ready to share. And I can bring that to my feature team or to the product blog or whatever publishing venue it is. In this case, right now, it's this webinar that I'm recording. And I can present those results to whoever my audience is, knowing that it's much better off in terms of quality than it would have been if I had just tried to start from scratch. And the entire process of getting there is much more pleasant and enjoyable. And finally, at the end of it all, I have all of these different pieces that I can use again for something else. So maybe I'll write a blog post on spaced repetition, and I can draw on a bunch of the content that I already used for this presentation and just present it in a different format. So incremental writing is a really great tool that applies spaced repetition to producing written outputs. But I've found that spaced repetition as a method of programming my own attention is actually really effective in a handful of other ways that improve my outputs as well. One of them is habit building, and I find that one of the challenges with developing new habits is that I'll just forget to do it because it's new. I'm not in the habit of doing it yet. And so I need those reminders to help me start building up that consistency so that I don't have to think about it and have a reminder because it's something that I'll do by default. And so spaced repetition is great here because you can essentially just make a prompt like go to the gym twice a week. And if it comes up and it's, I don't know, maybe a Tuesday and you haven't been to the gym yet this week, you know that in order to be on track for twice a week, you need to go today. So you get that reminder. And you can mark it as good. You go to the gym that day, and then a few days later, it'll pop up and remind you again. And if you're doing good at the habit, you can push it out longer because you're roughly on top of the habit. You're doing a good job. But if you realize, like, actually, I'm behind, I haven't been doing this, maybe you mark it as hard and it'll come up sooner in your queue so that you get reminded more frequently. And you can use that to sort of zero in on the right level of reminder frequencies that works for you. I've found in my own experience having like a daily reminder on my calendar doesn't always work because I see it so often, I'll just start to ignore it. And so spaced repetition, since it's a little bit more strategic about when it reminds me of things, I find that it works a little bit more effectively in helping me build habits. I also think it's great to use spaced repetition for climbing Bloom's taxonomy. If you're not familiar with it, it's essentially just a taxonomy or breakdown of different levels of learning. And so it goes all the way from basic recall up through being able to use what you've learned to create or synthesize new works. And so I'll write prompts that encourage me to do the next step up in something that I've been learning. So as an example of this, I've been learning about the business model canvas recently, which is a really short, abridged way of building a business plan. And one of the things that I did in order to improve how well I learn and retain and am able to apply what I've learned there is that I've built a prompt to actually go and apply what I learned about the business model canvas by making one for a business that I've either visited recently or think would be worth starting. And so then I get that actual practice in applying what I've learned over time consistently. And I've found that as I go through this exercise, I've gotten better and better at writing these business plans. Another one is a reading queue. Sometimes I'll get linked an article or even a YouTube video or a book or something, and I don't have time to read it right then. But by adding it to a queue, I can be reminded. And instead of just deleting it off the queue because I don't have time right then or worrying about forgetting it, if I consistently over time think, I don't want to read this right now and push it out, it's going to wait longer and longer before reminding me until it's effectively deleted. But if I see it and I think, this is something that's really important to me, I really want to read it, I can mark it to be brought up in my spaced repetition queue sooner so that I'm more likely to see it again and more likely to have time when it pops up to be able to review it. So we've learned a lot today. I want to go through a quick recap of the main points. So the first one is spaced repetition, which at its core is doing active learning over increasing periods of time, where you really engage with the content that you've learned. And this is going to help you internalize what you've learned and remember it so that you're able to apply it in everyday life. Personal knowledge management is how you catalog the things that you've learned and use that as the building blocks to think through harder and harder problems. And finally, incremental writing is how we bring these things together in order to produce great outputs. Now, I'm sure you're going to be wondering, what sort of tools are there out there to help me with these things? And in the early days, the sort of personal knowledge management system that first existed, it was called Zettelkasten. And this was back in, I think, the 60s. And the sociologist who did that did it just on paper note cards. And he had a very specific system of how he ordered them. But this is not necessarily my recommendation to you, but it shows that the technology that you use isn't really that important. So find the one that works for you. For spaced repetition in particular, Anki is by far the most popular. It's the most feature-rich option out there. I personally really like Obsidian. It's a super lightweight app. It works on mobile and desktop by using plain markdown files, which is great for me because my team's all developers. And so when I write a spec and it's in markdown, I can just put that spec in a pull request and we can go and review it through all of the tools that they're already familiar with. And so it's a really low friction option for me. But I know plenty of people are thrilled with other offerings as well, like Roam Research or RemNote or Notion, I think is by far the most well-known of these. And so I encourage you to explore them, try them out, find the one that works for you, and really pick the tool that works for the workflow you want to use rather than trying too hard to adopt your workflow to a particular tool. Thank you for attending my talk. I hope you've learned something really valuable and you'll be able to apply these to become 1% better every day. If you have any thoughts or comments or you want to continue the discussion, feel free to reach out to me on one of these channels. I have some examples of my notes on my website. And if you do want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please just mention that you came from this talk so I know you're not some random on the internet, and I'll be sure to accept it.